Woman, an in-depth exploration of the world of women today with Sandra Elkin.
Good evening and welcome to Woman. We're going to continue to look at the image of women in the media. Tonight, women's pages. With me is Barbara Hinton. Barbara has been a newspaper woman for 20 years. 10 of those years were spent as an editor of the women's pages, most recently for the Las Vegas Review-Journal. Also here is Judy Klemesrud, a journalist who's had many articles published in magazines such as Esquire, McCalls, New York Magazine, and many others. Judy is a women's page reporter for the New York Times. Welcome to both of you. Do either of you object to the term women's pages? I know that's hardly ever used anymore, and most newspapers are changing the title of their women's pages. Do you?
I don't object because that's what it is.
I don't object because it's such a far cry from what I'm usually called a society editor.
And that's really how women's pages began, really. They were society pages.
And when someone says society editor, it incenses me a little bit because I'm so much more than that. I feel I am a women's news editor, but that's also evolving too into other things.
Why do you think the change was made from society into some of the more slightly serious things?
The women's movement mainly, and a reaction of the editors to complaints from feminists.
I feel it might have even started before the feminist movement, just by women who want to think and be educated. Housewives who got tired of not knowing anything. I really feel that there was a movement brought on even before the official feminist movement started.
When do you think that the pages first started to change then? Betty Friedan founded Now in 1966. I don't think they started to change until about
Not
68.
drastically, that's true. There was no drastic change until that time.
But it certainly wasn't because of a great hue and cry from women who were reading these pages, was it?
That's a little bit difficult to answer, really, because it's always hard to say what results from the general public or what comes from the women's news editors themselves with ideas. You know, it's really a very difficult thing to say.
Well, as an editor of women's pages, you know, most of the last 10 years, although you've gotten out of the newspaper business recently,
Yes.
let me ask you first why you did that.
Well, there are various reasons why you get out of a field, but one of the reasons is because of the very low pay. Newspapers are traditionally low in pay, and many people hate to go into journalism because they know that it's going to be a low-paying field. But the women's news sections, and I think Judy will probably agree with me on this, are notoriously low-paying in comparison with even the rest of the paper.
Are there different kinds of people? Is there a difference in the quality of people who work on the women's pages? That's a charge that, you know, is often made, that reporters are not quite as sharp, that if there are even reporters.
I know that it's people say that women's pages are the dumping grounds for the older reporters, the neurotics, the ne'er-do-wells, the complainers. That's what you hear in the business.
It's also interesting, someone told me, or I read somewhere, that the women's section is always in the back of the building in the newspaper. Is that true at the Times?
It's way in the very back at the Times.
Mine's always lost in the center somewhere. But I feel that the quality of reporters depends on the editor who chooses her own help. And of course, the pay scale there is lower, so you have to take what you can get for the pay scale. But I have found some fairly decent applicants over the years.
Are there apt to be reporters on the women's pages, or are they just, you know, fashion-type people?
No, they are reporters. The ones that I have picked have been reporters. They have been journalism graduates.
When you first started, Judy, did you want to be on the women's pages?
When I first started, I was at the Chicago Daily News, and I was a general assignment reporter for 4 years. Then I came to the Times. I was hired as a women's page reporter, and I hoped that as soon as possible I'd get off the women's page and become a city desk reporter as I was in Chicago. But being there, there are many good things about working for a women's page. Your stories are much longer. The way you write, you have much more freedom. Your layouts are much bigger. You get maybe 8-column spreads with a lot of pictures, and you grow to like that.
I think it's more satisfying writing, yes.
So do you think it's more positive?
More positive approaches on most any subject. The first few pages of the paper always dwell on the latest murders, rapes, and robberies, and so on. And this seems to be what it's all about until you look in the inside and find the women's page, where they give you more of a scientific and more usually a positive approach on a given topic. such as sex therapy, marriage counseling, childbirth, et cetera, et cetera. It's really, I think, a more positive thing, yes.
Let's talk about some of the changes that the women's pages have gone through. First of all, they're not called women's pages anymore. They're family style or something like that. Do you think the changes are cosmetic? That charge has been made, that the changes that have been made so far are purely cosmetic and they're not really substantive?
Oh, I don't believe so. I think that they have definite substance. For instance, when I first worked in Illinois on the Champaign-Urbana Courier, I was going to college and working, and then after college also. Our whole section dwelled on the description of a bridal gown on any given bride, and the entire section was devoted to brides and engagements and the latest social happenings. And now we're on so many varied subjects and given to well, all sorts of things, really. And it's not just food, fashion, and fun, as we like to say sometimes, but it is really educational. Don't you agree with that?
Yes, I agree that the changes are substantive, but I think the big changes came between 69 and 73, and that now most of the women's pages that I read and study are reverting a little bit and going back to the old traditional ways. That's because some of the stories we pioneered in, like lesbian mothers, homosexual marriages, sex therapy, have been taken off our pages and put in the run of the paper in the news sections. And now women's pages are going back to being consumer-oriented and service-oriented.
In other words, the news and wire editors are stealing our stuff.
Right, right.
This is true.
Because
too.
we made such a big splash when we
Yes.
pioneered in these areas, and now the other editors are taking it away from us.
Do you think that some editors see the women's page as sort of an adjunct of advertising?
Yes.
I mean, it seems sometimes to me you pick up a women's page and it seems like the content almost, enhances the advertising, or is certainly compatible with the advertising.
Well, that's quite true. In fact, in some newspapers, the advertising is so first and foremost that the advertising department sends you releases to put in about their clientele, and they must be put in. But of course, they don't tell you exactly how much to put in or anything. You can edit it down, this type of thing. But it is, as you say, somewhat advertising.
So what choice do you have as an editor? I mean, what do you do with that material? I mean,
You bury it as much as possible, because it's not really what you want to say beneficial news to your readership. It makes a woman's editor a little resentful, I think, to have to use this kind of thing when you see all this good news material going by the wayside. You don't have the space for it. Advertising has become first and foremost in every newspaper because, of course, they must make money. And now they've gone from what used to be almost in any newspaper, a single pyramid advertisement up one side of the page.
Mm-hmm.
Now it goes up both sides of the pages quite frequently and takes up so much editorial space that, well, for instance, over the last few months, my news space had gone down on Sundays from 1,200 inches to 800 or 900 inches per Sunday, and that's a lot. That's a big deficit in news space.
Is that the only way the economic crunch has really affected the women's pages? I mean, are people from the women's pages first fired, or is that the first place where cuts are made?
Quite frequently, this is true, yes. They're trying to combine departments in a lot of newspapers.
It's the first place where the advertising department starts to tamper, too.
Yes, that's true. They put the ads on the other pages and lessen the inches for the women's pages, that's true.
Judy, talk a little bit how the women's page from the Times has changed since you've been there, changes that you're aware of.
I came in '66, and in 1968 we started to go into the serious subjects that women's pages hadn't really gone into before, the lifestyles, the sex stories. And then in '73 I noticed this change back that I mentioned, going back towards more consumer type stories as the other departments took away the stories that we had once done.
Judy, were you hired to do these controversial stories?
No, I was hired to go along with what had been done, but the times changed. Remember, that was the Democratic Convention.
Yes.
The times were changing. Everybody was experimenting with new lifestyles, and somebody had to cover it, and the women's pages started doing that.
Well, you know, part of the fault in these changes sometimes lies in the women themselves that read the pages. For instance, when I first went to Las Vegas from California in 1973, the first 6 months was utterly miserable because the women would not accept the change in the section that I was making.
The women readers?
The women readers, yes. they were used to the more social type of section.
Well, how did they make this known that they didn't like what you were doing?
Oh, they would call or send a few letters, this kind of thing. And so I was called in and asked to sort of draw back a little bit and go back to some of the old ways, more weddings, more engagements, more social news, and more chit-chat type of thing. And at least for a while, until they got used to this new lifestyle section, which I call Life Today. And then I found a gradual acceptance. People are always hesitant to accept change, as you well know, in anything. And as they began to accept this, then they got excited about it. They really did. And I started getting many, many letters of congratulation, and assembly women, many important women throughout the state began calling me and writing to me and telling me that they really did enjoy the change, and certainly have done so far more over the last year or so even.
What are some changes that you would have liked to have made that you couldn't? I mean, would you like to get rid of all the engagement pictures?
Yes, I frankly would, because they take up a lot of space. I wouldn't mind using a little writing space to announce an engagement or a forthcoming date for a marriage or something. But it's so unnecessary to put an engagement picture in and then 6 weeks later or 2 months later put a picture of the bride in or the bride and groom in. It's a repetitious type of thing that should be done away with, I think.
Is there any chance of that happening, or is there any move toward that?
On many of the larger papers, yes.
Not as long as the publisher has friends.
So you think the pressure to do that really doesn't come from the readership?
I think, I think the executives on paper,
It comes from a status-seeking public, right?
It comes from status-seeking editors, too, who want their friends' daughters to be in the paper when they get engaged and married.
For instance, I will cite an example of a policy which I made when I went there, that no couple could have their picture in unless they had been married 50 years or more, as far as anniversaries were concerned. And as Judy said, I had a couple of requests from editors and publishers over me to put in pictures of friends of theirs who were married only 35 years or something like this, because they wanted to give them special recognition. And once you set a policy, you really can't do this for friends. I couldn't do it for my friends and feel right about it.
Now, you're both from papers in different parts of the country. I mean, you're sort of west. Judy, you're a very eastern establishment, New York Times. What are the issues? Do you think there's a difference between what the women in Las Vegas and in the West are interested in and the women who read the New York Times? I mean, are you covering different things than the Times is covering for women?
The Times, of course, would like to assume that the women who read our page are quite intelligent. Whether or not that's the case, I don't know. Probably they're a little more intelligent than the women in Las Vegas, although that could be a very elitist thing for me to say. I don't know.
Well, I think that's a little presumptuous in a way, Judy, but we have quite a few intelligent women in Las Vegas also. It is true that we probably have, you know, the showgirl element, the cocktail waitress element, and so on, although you'll find that many girls who are cocktail waitresses are very intelligent. They're making $600 or $700 a week. They can't be too dumb.
It's more than I make.
But nevertheless, I think the level of intelligence across the country does not say what they're interested in. It's simply that there are different interests. You're far more interested in the feminist movement on the two coasts than we are inland for some reason. And don't ask me why. I can't say why. But the coastal regions are always the first to bring forth any fad or any new thing, and then it moves inland from there.
That's sort of across the board. That's not necessarily, you know, having to do with the women's movement.
No, that's any
Yeah.
topic I'm talking about. Fashions are the same way, anything, yeah.
As long as you brought up fashions, what about fashions? I mean, are you really convinced that the amount of space that's devoted to fashion reflects the amount of interest in the readers?
No.
I took down the space in my pages from fashion when I started editing it for the last newspaper I worked for. I found that women can well do without that, as long as they get a little hint of what's going on. They're satisfied with that. And I do feel it's a waste of space to put in the huge pictures, the large amount of copy on the fashion changes, because they're just not interested in it anymore. They're too casual now. Men are too.
I agree, but New York is the fashion industry, and I think perhaps it can be justified to give a little bit more fashion coverage in the New York Times for that reason. But I frankly don't think women really care that much anymore about fashion.
Well, they always care about things like Mr. Blackwell's list of
Oh,
worst
yeah.
dressed, you know, the controversial things in fashion, or some, you know, definite new change that's come about, which they either approve or disapprove of, this kind of thing. But aside from that, they're not interested in blue and green being popular 10 years ago versus the camel now or something like that. They're not nearly as interested as they used to be. I think they have more time to dwell on more deep subjects than this or something. They're making time to dwell on them.
What do you think are the issues? I mean, do you think they are the issues of the women's movement that people are most interested in? If you could create, you know, in your fantasies a page, you know, what would be on it?
Definitely, the ERA passage throughout the United States is one of the top issues in my part of the country. What about yours?
The ERA, alimony, still equal work for equal pay,
This is one of the
job discrimination.
popular things, yeah.
So really, it kind of boils down to practical advice, doesn't it?
Yes, and economy, I think, yeah.
There are things that, you know, the women pages aren't doing that seems to me they could be doing. It seems to me also that Ralph Nader is doing some things that could be done on the women's pages, his investigations of consumer issues. Now, why isn't that kind of thing happening? I mean, sure, that's getting reported, but it's usually reported in another part of the newspaper.
That's because of the wire editorship more than it is anything else. The wire editors on the given papers do not filter this to the women's pages, you see, and they're the ones that pass out the information.
And on the New York Times, our consumer reporter is a woman named Frances Sarah. She does not write for the women's page. She writes for the Metropolitan desk, the general news side. So that means our editors regard consumerism as general news rather than as a women's page story.
You mean if you wanted to do a piece, you probably couldn't do it?
Probably because Fran Sarah has the knowledge in that field and she should do it. So most consumer things go to Fran Sarah, although people in the women's page have done consumer pieces. They don't do them as much as Fran Sarah does.
Which brings up another little interesting story of something that you were talking about, advertising versus editorial. We did a very thorough survey in our city on the supermarkets and the ones who were higher priced versus the quality of the foods that they put out and the quantity and so on. And this story was, we were refused printing of the story by the top editors because these were our major advertisers on our food pages. We have a large food section on Wednesdays. And we couldn't print the story because it would go against our advertisers, in other words, or against some of them. Of course, it would make others heroes. So in this way, you see, you were withholding news that probably should be printed in these times of bad economy.
You know, it's hard to criticize the newspapers because they are in very bad economic shape. But on the other hand, you sometimes wish they were a little bit less timid about doing things. Have you ever tried to do something and been stopped?
I once did a piece on bisexuality that the editors decided that wasn't quite the subject for the women's page, and I then sold it to New York Magazine. I've had a couple things.
It was too controversial, was that it?
Another reporter once did a story rating the women's restrooms in New York, you know, giving them stars, and the editors decided that wasn't quite the subject for the women's page, and she also sold that to New York Magazine. So there are certain subjects that editors decide just don't work on the women's page.
And magazines will treat with more open-mindedness, yes.
Is that the only recourse you have? I mean, it seems to me it's very difficult, but it was hard to find someone to come and do this show, in a sense, because we wanted a working newspaper woman, and yet to really say what you'd like to say, you're really in danger of losing your job, in a sense.
That's very true. I'm glad that you were able to fathom that.
Well, Judy, you can always go into something else. You can be a housewife.
Judy, we'll find you a job. Which brings me to the coverage of International Women's Year. There was a lot of criticism about that. A lot of people felt that it was emphasizing all the negative things that happened, some of the rifts there, and that it wasn't fair reporting at all. And I know you covered it for the Times. How do you feel about that?
I think I'm very proud of the way the Times let myself and Jim Sturba, who was the other reporter assigned to it, cover it. They gave it front page coverage almost every day. They ran every story we wrote, although the editors took out some of the more colorful phrases. That's the only complaint I had, editing out a few words here and there. We had complete freedom to report that the way we wanted to. And I was surprised at the amount of times they put the stories on the front page.
Yeah, that's true. It was front page coverage. What did you do about it?
Not too much. In fact, I was surprised at the poor play that it got in our section of country, considering we were closer and everything. But I never received much over my desk from the wire editor on this.
So it wasn't your decision not to?
No, it wasn't, and it was underplayed quite a lot. Of course, I don't think there was anything really major that was decisive things that came out of that conference anyway. I think you'll probably agree with that.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
right.
You were there and you covered it.
Although there were a lot of women there, and there was a large display of feminism and so on.
Most of the reporters there were feminist reporters who went down there hoping they could just write praiseworthy stories. I mean, and when the coverage comes out negative, you can't blame anybody really, because we were all women feminists there.
They were willing, but there just wasn't the material to cover, I think.
You have to tell it the way it was.
Incidentally, I made a faux pas just a few moments ago. I said something about you could always be a housewife. And I'm going to have a lot of reaction to that remark, because there are so many housewives who prefer to be called homemakers now. And this is one of the things, isn't it, that you learn when you're working on a woman's page, that they really take issue with this now.
We're going to put up a card so that people know who said that. Judy didn't say that. I didn't say that.
How could I be a housewife when I'm not married?
Well, it's going to be difficult.
Right.
Judy, I just want you to continue to comment about International Women's Year for a minute. And the coverage in Mexico City. I got the impression that you weren't very impressed with what was going on there.
That's true. Good it came across. Well, no, nothing really much did happen there, except a lot of shouting, and the wife of the Egyptian president refused to talk to the wife of the Israeli president. That's about the most colorful thing that happened. The World Plan of Action was passed, but it didn't contain all that much in it for women, and it probably won't be implemented because men run the world government, so there's really nothing much that happened there.
Do you think everything, well, you know, you said men run the world government there. They also run newspapers.
Yes, that's quite true.
Is that why we have all these complaints about women's pages?
From what I've been hearing from my friends around the country, and this may sound foolish, but people who work on women's pages that I know seem to think that the male editors' wives are getting a little bit uppity by when they read all the feminist-oriented stories we've been running on women's pages, and perhaps that's why male editors have been cracking down on women's pages, because their own wives have been getting uppity and taking courses and going back to college and generally not being the typical nice stay-at-home housewife that the male editors want.
Yes, you hear all kinds of reasons, like, you know, I've not heard anyone say that before quite as blatantly, but you hear reasons like people don't want to read about that, people aren't interested in these issues. But it's true that a lot of people read women's pages, right? I mean, the New York Times, is it the third most?
One of the best read pages in the whole paper, according to our research.
Each place that I have gone and changed the section from, quote, the old-style society section to either women's news sections or family sections, which I think it evolves into, I have had men comment to me after I've been there, say, a year, well, I didn't used to read that page at all, but I certainly do now, and I find it interesting. You know, I've had many comments like this. So I really do believe it's a well-read section, and it's too bad that it's so underplayed, you might say.
Barbara, from looking over your section, the section that you're editor of, it seems to me very unisex. Is there women's news, or are we moving in the unisex direction, do you think?
I think this is what primarily it leads to. If you convert the section the way it should be converted, we have done stories on, for instance, suicides around Christmas time, this kind of thing. So many in-depth stories that are both for men and women. And why should you limit it to just women? You know, why should there be a reason to do this? And that's why it becomes a unisex section, so-called. Yet we still play up the fashions and cultural events. In my particular section, I have adopted a theory that's widespread across some of the larger papers in the country, where you take your section and you divide it into organizational parts, the arts, the local news, the home, travel, different sections, and then when people are interested in a given topic, they can look for it on that certain page. And we don't really just dwell on women's news in any of these topics. We have men artists, we have male fashions, you know, this kind of thing too. We try to vary it so much that everybody's interested in it. So that's why I think it's probably more of a lifestyle section. Life Today, mine was called, instead of just a women's news section anymore.
I wish we could resolve, you know, your disagreement earlier. Judy thinks that, you know, it's regressing, and you think it's getting better.
Well, I think it's getting better as long as there are progressive women's news editors that are thinking along the lines that they should.
But I was at the Penny, Missouri annual event last fall where all the women's editors in the country get together for prizes and everything.
Yes.
And most of the people I talked to agreed with me out there. They say that their male editors are clamping down. They're not being able to cover the subjects they used to cover. They have to go back to consumerism and happy family stories and that.
If they want it to be a women's section, yes.
No, but these are all lifestyle sections.
Are they?
Yeah. For example, one person I was talking to at the Miami Herald said that the editor called her up very irate one morning and said, "How did you dare run a story that had the word masturbation in the headline? Never again, never again."
Well, I don't know. We've done quite a lot of this and haven't had any complaints. In fact, we've had many, many compliments from our readers over the last year, and we have certainly continued to do the other thing.
Well, I certainly enjoy the improvement. I mean, I enjoy reading the women's pages much more than I ever did. Because
our makeup is so much better than it used to be, too, you know.
Yes, right.
We've gone into the 6-column format versus the 8-column, which is rather droll. And we use a quotation out of the story in bigger type to lead the eye into the story. It's more of a Western makeup, perhaps, than Eastern, I'm not sure. But it is more of an open, airy makeup that leads your eye into the page more. And
you know, one thing I think that would be interesting to discuss, I spoke a little bit about the advantages of working on a women's page, like the long stories and the bigger display, but you know, there are disadvantages to working there too. As Barbara mentioned, the salary. You're regarded as a second-class citizen by reporters on the news side. If you've got a really good story, it's taken away from you and given to a reporter on the news side. It's taken out of your section. We get really tiny little press cards that don't enable us to go places where the
we don't
news
even get our
side
name on the
reporters
masthead
go.
most of the time.
Right.
As a matter of fact, yeah.
But you're going to stay with it, Judy.
Well, I like the freedom of writing and the big play. Maybe I'm an egomaniac. I don't know.
We're out of time. Thank you both very much. Thank you for watching, and good night.
Woman was produced by WNED-TV, which is solely responsible for its content, and was funded by public television stations, the Ford Foundation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.